She was a whirlwind of energy on stage, a wild voice that could shatter silence. Her name was Rose Maddox, and she was known as the Queen of Hillbilly Boogie. In her time, she was a giant, a daring woman who led her family band to greatness, which makes her story all the more heartbreaking. A lonely battle against disease, poverty, and neglect. Let's find out why the woman who paved the way for the legends we love was nearly erased from the pages of music history. To understand the fire that drove Rose Maddox, you first have to understand the dust that she came from. The Great Depression has its cold, tight grip on America, and nowhere is that grip tighter than in the Dust Bowl. The sky over states like Oklahoma and Alabama turned a sickly brown as years of drought and poor farming practices allowed the topsoil to simply blow away. Families who had farmed the land for generations watched their livelihoods and their futures vanish into the wind. This was the world of the Maddox family. Hailing from Boaz, Alabama, Charlie and Lula Maddox were raising a brood of 7 children in a sharecropper's shack with little hope and even less money. Faced with starvation, they did what hundreds of thousands of other desperate Okies and Arkies did. They looked west. California became a symbol, a promised land of fruit groves and sunshine, a place to start over. But getting there was a brutal test of survival. The Maddoxes had no car, no money for bus fare. Their only way out was to become nomads, riding the rails. Charlie Maddox and his 4 oldest sons, Cal, Fred, Don, and Henry, left first, hopping onto freight trains, hiding from railroad police, sleeping in hobo jungles. It's a story we often romanticize, but the reality was terrifying. It was a world of danger, hunger, and constant uncertainty. After months of grueling travel, they finally made it to California, sending for the rest of the family. Lula arrived with the younger children, including a 7-year-old Rose. This journey was not just a trip across the country, it was a crucible. It forged in the Maddox children a toughness, a resilience, and a fierce, almost defiant will to survive. That grit, born from dust and desperation, would become the secret ingredient in their music. California wasn't the immediate paradise they'd hoped for. They were migrant workers, picking fruit and cotton under the hot sun for pennies. But in this harsh new reality, they had one thing that was entirely their own: their music. The story of the Maddox brothers and Rose begins not in a recording studio, but on a local radio talent contest in Modesto, California, in 1937. Cal and Fred, the 2 oldest brothers, decided to enter. But there was a catch. The sponsor, a furniture store, would only sponsor a band, not a duo. Thinking on their feet, they promised to return the next day with their whole band. They rushed home and rounded up their younger brothers, Don and Henry, neither of whom really knew how to play their instruments yet. But they still needed something more, a spark. Their mother, Lula, a woman of formidable will and shrewd instinct, had the answer. She pointed to her youngest daughter, 11-year-old Rose, and declared, "You've got to have the girl in the band." Rose was terrified. She was a shy child and protested that she couldn't sing. Lula's response was simple and non-negotiable. "You can holler, can't you?" That night, Rose hollered, and in that moment, the most colorful hillbilly band in America was born. They won the contest, and their prize was a regular slot on KTRB radio. Lula Maddox became their manager, driver, and iron-fisted leader. She was the matriarch in every sense, negotiating contracts with the ferocity of a mama bear, ensuring her children would never know the poverty they'd fled from again. The band's sound was a chaotic, joyous explosion. It wasn't the mournful, high, lonesome sound of the Appalachian Mountains. This was California country music, a melting pot of influences. It was Western swing, gospel, sentimental ballads, and a heavy dose of boogie-woogie rhythm, all supercharged with a punk rock energy that was decades ahead of its time. They were loud, they were fast, and they were utterly infectious. At the center of this maelstrom was little Rose. Her voice, born from that first command to holler, was a force of nature. It was a powerful, clear, and surprisingly versatile instrument that could belt out a rowdy dance number 1 minute and break your heart with a tear-soaked ballad the next. The brothers provided wild, often comical harmonies and blistering instrumental solos. Their stage show was legendary. They would tell raucous jokes, leap around the stage, and engage in frantic, semi-choreographed chaos. Fred Maddox on the upright bass developed a slap basses technique that is now considered a foundational element of rockabilly. They were more than a band. They were a traveling party. And their look was as loud as their music. In an era when most country acts wore staid cowboy outfits, the Maddoxes burst onto the stage in a riot of color. They hired Nudie Cohn, the tailor who would later create Elvis's gold lame suit, to design their costumes. They were covered in sequins, rhinestones, and elaborate embroidery. Rose, in particular, was a spectacle of fringe, satin, and dazzling color. She was a living, breathing rebellion against the drab poverty of her childhood. After a hiatus for World War II, the band reunited in 1946 and their career exploded. They signed with 4-Star Records and later Columbia Records, scoring a string of hits. Their first major success, Sally Let Your Bangs Hang Down, was a risque, rollicking number that captured their playful energy. They followed it with classics like The Tramp on the Street, I'm a Gonna Go Fishin', and their signature song, the dramatic ballad Philadelphia Lawyer. They became regulars on the Louisiana Hayride and made frequent show-stopping guest appearances at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. By the late 1940s and early 50s, the Maddox brothers and Rose were one of the biggest acts in country music, their sound blaring from jukeboxes and radios from coast to coast. They had ridden a freight train out of the dust, and now they were riding a wave of fame and success dressed in rhinestones and powered by pure, unadulterated grit. Behind the dazzling costumes and the wild stage antics, the Maddox brothers and Rose were first and foremost a family. And like any family, theirs was a complex world of love, loyalty, and simmering tension. The glue that held it all together was their mother, Lula. She was the undisputed boss. She collected all the money, paid each of them an allowance, and reinvested the rest back into the band, buying new instruments, a bigger car, and ever more elaborate costumes. Her singular focus was the band's success, a mission to build a fortress of security against the ghosts of the Dust Bowl. For Rose, this meant growing up in a world that was both a whirlwind of excitement and a gilded cage. She was the star, the focal point, but she was also the youngest, surrounded by 4 older brothers and an indomitable mother. Her identity was completely wrapped up in the band. The flamboyant persona she adopted on stage was both a performance and a form of self-discovery. She once explained her love for the flashy outfits in a quote that reveals the deep psychological wound of her childhood poverty. We'd been so poor. My gosh, we'd been so poor. I was going to be flashy. I was going to wear everything I thought was pretty. Every rhinestone was a tiny victory over the dust. Her voice was her power. While the brothers were incredible musicians and showmen, it was Rose's singing that connected with the audience on a deep emotional level. She could channel the rowdy energy of a Saturday night dance hall, but she could also convey profound heartache and vulnerability. Listen to her recording of The Tramp on the Street, a sentimental song about a dying, disgraced woman. Rose doesn't just sing the words, she embodies the character's sorrow and desperation. It's a performance of raw, unfiltered empathy that could silence a rowdy barroom. This duality The wild party girl and the heartbroken balladeer was the core of her appeal. However, by the mid-1950s, the world was changing, and so were the Maddoxes. The brothers, now men with wives and children of their own, were growing tired of the relentless life on the road. They yearned for stability, for a life outside the constant supervision of their mother. The rise of rock and roll, a genre they had helped pioneer, was also changing the musical landscape. The family that had been inseparable for nearly 2 decades began to fray. In 1956, after a final triumphant tour of the Grand Ole Opry, the unthinkable happened. The Maddox brothers and Rose broke up. The split was devastating for Rose. At 31 years old, the only life she had ever known was gone. The band wasn't just her job, it was her family, her identity, her entire world. The emotional impact of this separation cannot be overstated. She was suddenly alone, professionally and personally, for the first time in her life. While she quickly signed a solo contract with Capitol Records, the transition was jarring. She was no longer part of a chaotic, supportive family ensemble. The spotlight was now hers alone, and with it came an immense pressure to redefine herself in a rapidly shifting industry. Her early solo career was successful, yielding hits like Sing a Little Song of Heartache and the rockabilly classic Wild, Wild Young Men. She even recorded one of the first true bluegrass albums by a female artist, Rose Maddox Sings Bluegrass, backed by legends like Bill Monroe and Don Reno. But the ground was already shifting beneath her feet. The Nashville establishment was about to change the rules of the game, and Rose, the queen of Hillbilly Boogie, was about to find that her kingdom was vanishing. Rose Maddox's career was built on being an outsider. Her music was born in the migrant camps of California, not the hallowed halls of Nashville. This geographical and cultural distance would come to define the central conflict of her professional life. The controversy, if one can call it that, wasn't about personal scandal, but about artistic identity and the politics of an industry in transition. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Nashville was undergoing a seismic shift. In response to the raw energy of rock and roll, producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley created the Nashville sound. It was a deliberate smoothing of country music's rough edges. The fiddles and steel guitars were replaced by lush, string arrangements and background choirs. The raw, emotional vocals of singers like Hank Williams and Rose Maddox were swapped for the smoother, crooning styles of artists like Eddie Arnold and Jim Reeves. It was a commercially brilliant move that brought country music to a wider, more pop-oriented audience. But in the process, it began to systematically erase the very artists who had laid the genre's foundation. Rose Maddox was the antithesis of the Nashville sound. She was too loud, too raw, too flamboyant, and unapologetically hillbilly. Her music was made for dance halls, not for suburban living rooms. Capitol Records, her label at the time, tried to push her in this new, smoother direction. They saddled her with syrupy arrangements and pop-oriented songs that suffocated her fiery vocal style. Rose resisted. She was a force of nature, and she refused to be tamed or polished. This refusal to compromise, while artistically admirable, was professionally devastating. Furthermore, she was a woman in a man's world, but not the kind Nashville was becoming comfortable with. Artists like Patsy Cline and Kitty Wells, for all their talent, often projected a persona of vulnerability or domesticity. Rose was a bandleader. She was brassy, assertive, and exuded a powerful, independent sexuality that made the conservative Nashville establishment uneasy. She wasn't a girl singer, she was the boss. This fierce independence, which had been her greatest strength, was now becoming her greatest liability. As the 1960s wore on, her records stopped charting. She was dropped by Capitol and spent the remainder of her career hopping between smaller independent labels. She continued to tour relentlessly, playing to a loyal but shrinking audience in clubs and at bluegrass festivals. The Queen of Hillbilly Boogie had become a wandering exile, a legend from a bygone era in an industry with an increasingly short memory. To understand the significance of Rose Maddox, you have to look past the record charts of her later years and see the deep, indelible footprints she left on the landscape of American music. Her legacy is not just in her own recordings, but in the sound and style of countless artists who followed. First and foremost, Rose Maddox was a crucial bridge between country music and rock and roll, the Hillbilly Boogie sound that she and her brothers perfected, with its driving rhythm, slap bass, and high-energy vocals, was the primordial soup from which Rockabilly emerged. When a young Elvis Presley was honing his sound in Memphis, the Maddox brothers and Rose were already a major influence, their records a staple on Southern radio. Equally important was her role as a female trailblazer. Long before the term women's liberation entered the popular lexicon, Rose Maddox was living it. She was a front woman who didn't just sing with the band, she led the band. Her confident, often confrontational stage presence shattered the mold of the demure female vocalist. But the final chapters of Rose Maddox's life are a heartbreaking testament to the cruelty of an industry that demands eternal youth and novelty. After decades of relentless touring, the years on the road began to take their toll. She settled in Oregon, far from the music centers of Nashville and California, but she never truly retired. Music was the only life she knew, and she continued to perform whenever she could, her voice, though weathered, still capable of that incredible fire. And as it happened, her health began to fail. She suffered a series of heart attacks and battled kidney disease requiring dialysis. Hospital bills mounted, and the woman who had been one of country music's biggest stars found herself in dire straits. The money she had earned from years of hit songs and sold-out shows was gone, and she had to pay for her living and medical bills. It was a tragic and bitter irony. The woman who had worn rhinestones to get through a poor childhood was once again facing poverty in her later years. Her friends and loyal fans in the West Coast country and bluegrass communities rallied around her. Benefit concerts were organized to help pay her medical bills. Artists who had grown up idolizing her, like Merle Haggard and Buck Owens, spoke out, reminding the world of her immense contribution. But from the Nashville establishment, the institution she had once electrified with her guest spots at the Opry, there was mostly silence. She had been out of the mainstream for too long. She was a ghost from a past they had moved on from. In a candid interview near the end of her life, she reflected on her legacy with a mixture of pride and quiet sorrow. "I opened up the door for a lot of people," she said. "I was a woman and I was out there, and I took a lot of stuff. But I showed them that a woman could be a star." There was no bitterness in her voice, only the weary resignation of someone who knew her own worth, even if the world had forgotten it. On April 15, 1998, Rose Maddox died of kidney failure in Ashland, Oregon. After a long battle with heart disease, she was 72. Her death did not make headlines. To the mainstream country music world, a world that had left her behind, she was little more than a historical footnote, a name on a black and white photograph. But to her devoted fans, music historians, and the artists she inspired, her passing was a devastating loss. News spread through small radio stations, bluegrass and folk magazines, and early internet forums. It was not a nationwide outpouring of grief, but a deep, simmering grief among those who knew her significance. Fans shared memories of seeing her and her brothers perform, of their explosive energy and sparkling costumes. They spoke of her warmth and intimacy backstage, of how she always had time for the audience. Musicians, from her contemporaries to a younger generation, spoke out in praise of not only her unique voice, but also her uncompromising spirit. Her death was not a media event, but the passing of a godmother, a loss deeply felt by those who knew that the country music kingdom had lost one of its true queens. Rose Maddox's story did not really end with death. Her life is a powerful and poignant reminder that music history is more than just a series of famous names and hit songs. Rose is a testament to the enduring power of an indomitable spirit. She may have been forgotten by the mainstream, but to those who listen, her passionate and indomitable screams still resonate.